Okay, class today, I'm going to lecture a little while, I'm going to show a video, and then I'm going to end with a story. So, the only other thing I want to, of course, we are focusing on chapters 1 through 5. Do make sure you have worked your way through the textbook. Of course, this is specifically about the revolution itself. Did we talk enough about common sense? Who wrote it? Thomas Paine, very good. All right, the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to come back to that next week when we talk about the Constitution. What was the thing between the Declaration and the Constitution? Right up there. The Articles of Confederation. So you need to get those in mind, because what the bottom line is, the Declaration of Independence was our really first document as a soon-to-be group of people, right? That's why it matters. The Declaration of Independence set forth the philosophical underpinnings of what our founding fathers believed our country, which would become known as the United States of America, would be how we would be governed, the parameters in which we would be governed, and that matters. The Articles of Confederation were kind of the first attempt to formally organize, because they said, well, if we're going to proclaim ourselves to be free and independent, we need to act free and independent. The Articles were adopted in, by know what year? You can look in your textbook. You don't know the answer, know where to find the answer, right? 17, not 76, but Declaration of Independence was 1776 in July. It would be several months later the Articles would come into play. Look at your textbook. Where does it say? Where does it talk about that? What year? In fact, it's on the second page of the chapter. You remember the timelines that are there at the front of every chapter? Those are important. You should look at those multiple times. You know, to read a chapter means you don't just cursory read it while you're falling asleep at night and call it good. 1777. 1777. It became apparent in the 1780s, after the War of Independence was won, that the Articles were inadequate, and that's where that led. Their failure to fully encapsulate how the leaders, our founding fathers and mothers, believed the country ought to operate, led to the creation of the Constitution. And those two documents are still in play to this very day. Occasionally I read, hear people in our country, citizens of our country, who think the documents are passé. You know what that word means? Related to what sounds. Out of date, no longer useful, should be forgotten. The only problem is most people who vocally and vociferously, let me pronounce it right, who argue against things, if someone wants to criticize something, what's the first thing you should ask them? I mean, in America, we have the right of free speech. So we have the right of criticism. In fact, that's how often effective change comes about. But when you criticize something, what should you always have? If you're going to complain about something, not just even as a student, but certainly as you become an adult and an employee, if you're going to complain about something, what should you be prepared to offer? The reason why, and yeah, the solution. Okay, how are you going to make it better? So really, just to criticize something, our country has not been well served throughout the decades and a couple of centuries by people who wanted to just destroy things they didn't like, but had no alternative in place. Does that make sense? I mean, that just makes sense. If you're going to change something about your life, okay, why are you going to change it? Number two, what am I going to change to? And then that becomes real important. So I do think the Declaration of Independence, well, Abraham Lincoln described the Constitution as the silver frame around the the Constitution was the silver frame around the golden apple of the Declaration of Independence. That's how highly Abraham Lincoln viewed these two documents. So we'll talk more about that next week. But the intermediate document was the Articles of Confederation. Make sure you have some understanding of that. All right. I'm going to show you a video about some of the significant battles, the turning points in the war. True or false? The American patriots won the Battle of Bunker Hill.
False.
False. They did not. We did not. However, what was the significance for the patriots, for the colonists, for the rebels and revolutionaries? What was the significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill?
It did a lot of damage to the British.
Did significant damage to the British. That was in what I'll call the physical or military manner. What else did it do?
Raise morale.
What?
It raised morale.
Raised morale among whom?
Like all the other patriots that weren't fighting.
Exactly. The soon-to-be Americans, if we can call them that. The colonists, it was an encouragement and raised their morale. At the same time, it did what to the British?
Crushed theirs.
What? What?
They lost their morale.
They lost. They were discouraged at the same time the colonists were encouraged. And in any war throughout all of history, even modern day wars, there are critical turning points, and that was one of them. And like I said, I'm going to show a video about that. All right, let me make sure I say everything in my notes I want to say. In 1777, 1778, December of 1777 and bleeding over into January of 78, is the winter that Washington and his small army spent at Valley Forge, which is outside of Philadelphia. It was there that we will see, and I think that's referenced in this video I want to show, how that too was a significant change of, of resolve, if you will. It was a deepening of the colonists and the army in particular, commitment to fight as much, as long as needed to gain independence. Prior to that, in the fall of 1777, was the Battle of Saratoga between General Gates and General Bourgoin. That was significant, I think. The interesting part of the Battle of Saratoga was that basically America was being defeated until who took over? Who took charge, reorganized the army to lead the U.S. to victory at the Battle of Saratoga? Remember who?
Like the French general or something like that?
Huh?
Isn't like the general from France?
Well, no. General Arnold would take charge. And we talk about who is synonymous with treason in America. Benedict Arnold. He was actually a good soldier for America until he flipped and decided, okay, the advantages are for the other side, and he became a traitor to the country. But he did good before he did bad, which leads to my statement about people in general. The good are half bad, the bad are half good, you know. But all right. The ending of the war was at the Battle of Yorktown. The Battle of Yorktown was the critical, decisive, I think, end of the war where General Cornwallis would end up surrendering. When was the treaty of, well, number one, the treaty of what ended, officially, formally ended the Revolutionary War? The Treaty of Paris. Why is that significant? Why does that make sense? Why would that make sense? Paris is located where? In France. And the French were our ally. Okay, long-standing enemy of Great Britain. But yeah, the Treaty of Paris. Significant things coming out of the Treaty of Paris. Number one, the United States will be independent. Number two, everything to the Mississippi River. That was the parameters, that was the geography, those were the boundaries of America. Everything from the what ocean? Atlantic Ocean, all the way to the Mississippi River. Number 3, the debts that Americans owed the British would be paid. Debts that Americans owed to the British, they would be paid. Number 4, the Loyalists and Tories were required to flee the colonies, and the government would confiscate their property. If you had sided with the British, then we're going to say, okay, then go live in England. Most of them fled to where? Canada, Toronto in particular. You bet. Most of them. So it's like, sometimes when you hear talk about Canadians, this, that, and the other, it's like, well, you're welcome. We kind of helped start your country. But anyway, all right. The Articles of Confederation, quickly about those. Critical period in the U.S. history, I think, in many ways. There were some problems related to that in the creation of the Articles, which were formally adopted in 1777, but really began to be fleshed out in 1781. Number 1 was the problem of war and peace. Fulfilling treaties mainly was the issue. There were British forts, there were Tories who owned property, who sided with the British government, who were still hanging around, hadn't fled, hadn't left. Secondly was the issue of commerce, foreign trade in particular. Who was the primary trade partner in the colonies? Don't make it hard. The primary exchange of trade. Great Britain, yeah. The English. And so John Adams was the one who would go actually hammer out a trade treaty with the British government. Relatedly, domestic trade here at home, the state tariffs, whether it's New York Harbor or the Potomac River, all of those things that maybe I'm pretty sure that the smartest minds of our founding fathers had thought about, but you understand that if you're now an independent nation, all of that falls to you. Okay? The king in England's not going to manage things, handle things, oversee things. It's now up to us as Americans to do. Third was the issue of money and taxation. These are problems. The U.S. government had no power to tax at the time. Who had the power to tax?
Britain.
Well, initially Britain, but how did Great Britain and the English government facilitate that in the colonies?
They appointed governors.
What?
They appointed governors.
They appointed governors. And so taxation came from where? What entity?
The governor.
Huh?
The king.
The colonies, which had become states. And so that was a state issue at the time. And so it's like, okay, the states actually printed the money. Does that make sense? So the currency was localized in terms of these 13 states that had just been created. A creditor is somebody who does what? A creditor does what? If you don't have any cash and you need cash,
Oh, it's like
I'll give loans.
okay, but so the creditor is the one who
Loans even money.
loans the money. Kiana didn't have her head up. She was busy writing notes. Loans the money. Okay? Creditors, the debtor is the one who
What?
gets the money, but then therefore
In debt.
owes the money and is in debt. Exactly. So I'm the creditor, you're the debtor. Creditors, especially in Massachusetts, which was probably the strongest currency, creditors controlled the government in Massachusetts, meaning the ones who had loaned the money. It's just like now. You may or may not. If your parents live in a home and it's not paid for, who are they paying?
The person who owns the home.
If you're renting, then you're paying the homeowner every month. If you buy a home and you don't pay cash for it, which not that many people do, they borrow money from a mortgage company. So who actually owns the house until it's paid off? The mortgage mortgage company. You get the idea? That's the whole deal with the exchange of money. When it comes to government, David Shays was a poor farmer who ended up leading a rebellion. You need to note that toward the end of the chapter, Shays' rebellion, because the government said he had to pay taxes in good, sound money. He couldn't barter, but he had to have the good, sound money. Well, debtors were in control of Rhode Island as well. The money was hardly worth anything. Businessmen and bankers had major issues themselves. And so Shays' rebellion was a significant moment because it helped solidify the need for this national, federal, if you will, currency in the midst of that. I guess the last problem under the Articles of Confederation would be the Western lands. Who lived to the west? Indians did. Native Americans did. The British and Spanish forts are in the area from time to time. Traders sold guns and liquor, especially to the Indians. So those were just some of the big problems or issues related to the government under the Articles of Confederation. What was a failure? Failures, a couple of significant ones. The failure to remove all the British troops, the trade treaty that was initially enacted and agreed upon was really not a great treaty. The second big issue was the Spain and Florida boundary, the trade treaty with them, and the open Mississippi River, meaning anyone could utilize the mighty Mississippi River. In 1785, you do have a couple of successes in there. The Northwest Land Ordinance, which is northwest of the Ohio River. Surveying was done. Before I get too far away, notice some of those. We're going to look long enough to understand those phases of the war. Where do I want to go? Benjamin Franklin was, of course, instrumental in negotiating the peace. There's where the Land Ordinance of 1785. They ended up deciding they would organize townships in this way. See how they divided it into sections? 16 was reserved for school funds. One section was 640 acres. How much is one section today? If you say I own a section of land, what do you mean?
Acres.
How many acres?
100.
640. No, it's still the same. It's still the same measurement. Yeah, that's which was my point. A half a section is 320. A quarter section is 160. So this is still in operation what they came up with. A new system of surveying, and of course the ultimate goal was the selling of Western lands. When I say, does Virginia butt against the state of Virginia have coastline on the Atlantic Ocean?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Remember the first settlement in 1607 was at Jamestown. It's right on the coast. So that's where we're talking. Okay, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania goes all the way to just about. It gets close. Look at a map. Philadelphia is incredibly close to the coast. It's not on the coast, but so Pennsylvania goes this way as well. Look at the map. Northwest Ohio is kind of where we're starting, and of course it will proceed westward. But this was the plan going forward. And that was a significant, I think, success of the Articles of Confederation. The second big thing is, I would call it the Northwest Territorial Ordinance. It provided for the future statehood on equality with the original states. So 1787, the Northwest Territorial Ordinance said that future regions that organize into states would have the same rights, powers, and responsibilities as the original states. When there are enough people live out west, you can form a state and have equal status. By the way, the Northwest Territory also did what? It outlawed slavery. Okay? It outlawed slavery. Now let me just go off on a quick tangent here before I show the video. For that to be included as a part of these Articles of Confederation is an incredible statement about the direction, albeit haltingly. You know what I mean when I say haltingly? Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But that, I think, is a little caveat, a representation that our country was understood to some degree I may be overstating, the abhorrent nature of slavery. We're not going to let it be done elsewhere. It had already become ingrained in society, and as I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, among others, James Madison, didn't quite know, okay, how do we undo this thing? I have reservations, even mild convictions against it, but how do we undo that which is such a part of life? And so we would spend, as a country, the next, 60, 70 plus years wrestling with this thing until when?
The Civil War.
The Civil War. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. True or false? There were some people who were born and grew up learning, who were born at the beginning of, well, here, let me just use this as an example. Do you know what year Abraham Lincoln was born in? 1809. Okay? There were people born in the early days of our country who would play pivotal roles in this angst, abhorrent reality of slavery. So they were born about the time the country was trying to get started. And so they grew up during this period of the compromises, the discussions, the political debates, and all that went on related to slavery. But I think that was a significant part of the whole conversation. Well, gosh, even back in 1781, 1777 initially, but 1781 formally, as we began to really have some independence. Like I said, the Treaty of Paris was in 83. That was the formal end of the war, but we had already gained substantial control. It was kind of a formality at the end. Yorktown was like, okay, let's just say what we already know. Our British commitment to the war was gone. Anyway, so, all right. Ready, set. Maybe. I can never find back. Take notes. I am. There's our class. Ready, set, go.
April 19th, 1775. 400 British regulars approached the small village of Lexington, Massachusetts. 80 men of the local militia meet them on the town green. Stand your ground, their commander shouts. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. How did it come to this? Why are these American subjects facing down their king, George III, and his empire? The rallying cry is no taxation without representation. For 10 years, the American colonists have protested the taxes levied by the British Crown. The protests are sometimes eloquent and sometimes violent. No matter the method, the Americans have no voice in the British government. Most colonists are not yet ready to break away, yet they are determined to defend their rights to assembly, free speech, trial by jury, taxation by their own representatives, and to bear arms. The controversy explodes on that April morning. 2 British companies form a line of battle on the Lexington Green. A British officer orders the militia to disperse. Most of the men begin to scatter, but a few stubbornly stand their ground. A moment later, a shot rings out. Who fired that first shot, heard round the world, may never be known. The British then unleash a full volley into the militia. When the smoke clears, 8 Americans lay dead, and another 9 are wounded. In search of a rumored stockpile of American weapons, the British advance to Concord. Word of the movement spreads among the American patriots. At Concord, the British find only remnants of the Patriot stockpile. The real weapons are in the hands of the militia. 300 Americans attack the British column near the Concord River.
What
The
state?
British withdraw. The Americans pursue, and it devolves into a running battle. More militiamen, sometimes called Minutemen, arrive, using country paths to ambush their exhausted foes. British soldiers are killed or wounded continuously. Most run out of ammunition. Some consider surrendering. The British limp back into Boston, having lost nearly 300 men. Almost miraculously, the American patriots win their first battle. But the revolution has only just begun.
Do you know Honey? They save you money, and you can install it in like 10 seconds. Do I know Honey saves you money? I told you
Ignore the
it's a super easy
advertising.
online shopping money saver that has over 100,000 5-star reviews. I just used Honey, and I saved $40 on a sweet Honey bath. Self-care!
Within weeks, Boston is surrounded by an army of New England militia. As news of the first victory spreads, other Americans take action. In May, a group of men who call themselves the Green Mountain Boys seize Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. In June, the British attack an American position near Boston, a rise known to the locals as Bunker Hill. As the redcoat battle lines approach, an American commander tells his men not to fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The British are slaughtered. Although the British capture the hill, American morale rises as British morale plummets. Despite these early successes, American leaders know that they will need more than an enthusiastic militia to win the conflict. The Continental Congress, in session in Philadelphia, creates the Continental Army and appoints George Washington, a member of the Virginia delegation, to lead it. Washington rushes to join the army at Cambridge, Massachusetts, telling Congress that he will need heavy artillery to drive the British out of Boston. In January, he orders Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which advocates independence for Great Britain, to be read aloud to his soldiers in order to strengthen their resolve for the cause. Washington is aided by 25-year-old Henry Knox, who spends the winter removing cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and bringing them to Boston. Despite having to sled across frozen rivers and scale snowy mountains, Knox doesn't lose a single gun. By March of 1776, the American artillery is in place. Unwilling to suffer a bombardment or risk another attack, the British evacuate the city. Washington watches as the fleet sails away. He knows the enemy will soon return in even greater numbers. The question is where? The Patriots face enormous challenges. The British Empire wields incredible power. To win the revolution, the Americans will need foreign support. In early 1776, France begins to secretly send weapons to the colonists. But before the French will do more, the Americans need to demonstrate their determination. On July 4th, 1776, congressional delegates signed the Declaration of Independence, signaling to France that the United States of America is committed to victory and capable of achieving it. The war for independence has officially begun. Washington moves the Continental Army from Boston to New York, anticipating 17,000 patriots have joined him. And then the British return. 130 ships, carrying more than 20,000 soldiers, sailed into New York Harbor. One amazed American exclaims that all of London is afloat. August 22nd, the British land on Long Island, sweeping aside the American defenders at the Battle of Brooklyn. Washington skillfully retreats across Manhattan to Harlem Heights. In September, the British land on Lower Manhattan and capture the city, then dislodge the Americans from the defenses on Harlem Heights. Washington retreats again. Part of the army withdraws north to White Plains, while another occupies a strong position astride the Hudson at Forts Washington and Lee. William Howe, the British commander, defeats Washington at the Battle of White Plains on October 28th. In November, he decides to remove the threat to his rear at Forts Washington and Lee. The Battle of Fort Washington is a disaster. 3,000 Americans are overwhelmed and captured by the British assault. 4 days later, the British cross the Hudson and capture Fort Lee. Washington's army is reduced to but a few thousand men. With morale low and enlistment set to expire, he retreats across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. All that is stopping the British is the Delaware River and the coming winter. Convinced the rebels are all but defeated, the British spread out in numerous outposts throughout New Jersey. Washington must rekindle his army's confidence. He tells his men that if you will consent to stay only 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably never can do under any other circumstances. Thomas Paine writes a second pamphlet, The American Crisis, which circulates around campfires and steals the resolve of the patriots. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington makes good on his promise. He moves his forces across the ice-choked Delaware River. It is a desperate and dangerous maneuver, but it works. His men gather on the opposite bank, and Washington launches a surprise attack on Trenton, New Jersey. The Battle of Trenton is a stirring American victory. Nearly 1,000 Hessians are captured, along with 6 cannons and enough supplies to outfit several American brigades. 7 days later, Washington presses his advantage, outmaneuvering the main British army and striking the garrison at Princeton. He wins another victory and captures nearly 200 British regulars. With his army rejuvenated, Washington marches to Morristown and settles in for the rest of the winter. There is almost constant skirmishing between patriots and British foraging parties, forcing the New York City British-controlled garrison to rely on supplies brought by sea. In the spring of 1777, the British devise a plan to isolate New England from the other American colonies. 3 columns are ordered to converge on Albany, New York. 1 column is stopped at Fort Stanwix. 1 disregards the plan and instead moves toward Philadelphia, defeating an American force at the Battle of Brandywine and capturing the American capital. Washington attempts to recapture the city, but is defeated at the Battle of Germantown. Afterward, he moves his army to Valley Forge for the winter. The 3rd British column meets heavy resistance from partisan fighters, giving the Americans time to assemble a large force near Saratoga. The fighting at Saratoga rages from September to October. Victory sways the balance. Finally, the Americans surround the British army and force them to surrender. The Continental Army suffers through a brutal winter at Valley Forge, but holds together. Discipline actually improves due to the training regimen implemented by Baron von Steuben. a European officer who lends his expertise to the cause. It is one of the war's greatest displays of American determination. In the wake of the American victory at Saratoga, France signs an alliance with the United States and declares war on Britain. Threatened by the French fleet, the British abandon Philadelphia. Washington pursues them across New Jersey. On June 28th, Washington attacks a British rearguard at Monmouth, New Jersey. Although the battle is inconclusive, the winter training at Valley Forge has paid off. The Continentals had stood firm against British regulars who continued their movement to New York. Throughout 1778, Washington maintains pressure on New York City. The countryside between the armies becomes a no-man's land of spies, foraging parties, and skirmishes. Unable to make headway in the Northeast, British strategists shift their focus to the southern colonies, where a guerrilla war had raged since 1775. They are banking on the support of Southern loyalists. In December, the British established a foothold by capturing Savannah, Georgia. Months later, French troops joined the Americans in an attempt to recapture Savannah. But the Allies suffer severe losses and are unable to retake the city. The Southern offensive continues into 1780. On May 12th, the British Army captures Charleston, South Carolina, along with more than 5,000 American soldiers, nearly the entire American force in the South. American reinforcements rush to the Carolinas, but they fare little better. In August, another American army is crushed at the Battle of Camden. The countryside is still engulfed in a vicious partisan war. Neighbors take up arms against each other. When British troops and loyalists burn homes and farms in their search for patriots, they harden the revolutionary resolve of the Southern people. In October, a force of more than 1,000 British loyalists is annihilated at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Washington sends more men to the south, where they unite with Patriot militia fighters. Daniel Morgan leads the Americans to a major victory at Cowpens, but years of campaigning forced him to retire. Nathaniel Greene takes over. In a grueling campaign in early 1781, he grinds down the British forces during a series of strategic retreats toward the Dan River. Greene is able to keep one step ahead of the British. He crosses on February 14th, and the British, without boats, are unable to pursue. The race is over. After a brief rest, Greene, now reinforced, recrosses the dam. On March 15th, at Guilford Courthouse, Greene finally faces the British, fighting them to a bloody standstill. After Guilford, Cornwallis withdraws his battered and exhausted army toward Wilmington. Soon after, he marches north to Virginia, hoping to stop the flow of men and supplies into the southern colonies. With Cornwallis gone, Greene swiftly re-enters the Carolinas. At Eutaw Springs, though a draw, Greene inflicts enough casualties to compel a British withdrawal to Charleston, where Greene pins them for the rest of the war. Thwarted in the north and in the south, British strategists now try to attack the center. Cornwallis marches into Virginia and chases a Continental force before marching his weary army to Yorktown in July 1781, where he expects reinforcements by sea. On September 5th, the British and French fleets battle each other off the Virginia Capes. The French are victorious, and Cornwallis is cut off. A combined American and French force marches south and lays siege to the British on September 26th. On October 14th, American and French units storm two British redoubts. Cornwallis realizes that there will be no reinforcements, no escape. He surrenders. More than 8,000 soldiers, about 1/4 of all British troops in the United States are taken prisoner. News of Yorktown reaches London in late November 1781. In February 1782, the British Parliament adopts a resolution against further prosecution of offensive warfare on the continent of North America. The final treaty of peace is signed in September 1783. After 8 years of war, the longest war ever fought in North America, the United States win their independence. The American Revolution began the most important experiment the world has ever witnessed. Can people govern themselves? Can they treat each other as equals? Can liberty produce power? So far, through many rigorous tests, America has answered yes.
All right, one story. A 33-year-old commander, British commander, makes his way across the Atlantic to join the forces with General Howe in 1777. And at the Battle of Brandywine, do you remember that being mentioned? Patriots won or lost the Battle of Brandywine? Lost. That was just about a month before the Battle of Saratoga. That was, I think, a significant battle and turning point because of the morale standpoint. The Patriots won, Americans won. But a month before that, Patrick Ferguson, who actually improved one of the rifles that was used by the military and the British, just really articulate guy, very slender, wasn't very tall, but just really sharp, came from this great family in England around Edinburgh. And anyway, he makes his way. And in September of 1777, you got the timeline? We started fighting when? April of 1775. Yorktown was won in 17... No. The Battle of Yorktown in the South. Cornwallis surrenders October of 1781. The Treaty of Paris was signed in what year? 83. Exactly. You get the timeline. So it's kind of, okay, Yorktown was a critical battle, but the peace wasn't official, fully signed, etc. until 83. September 70, did the bell ring? Patrick Ferguson sees what seems to be an important rebel leader riding away from him, and as an excellent marksman has a clear shot. But because his back is turned riding his horse, he doesn't take the shot. You know who the rebel leader was? George Washington. Could have been taken out in September of 1777. He thought it wasn't honorable to shoot a man in the back, so he didn't. And as they say, the rest is history. I got the tables. Bye.
You want your dollar back?
No, you can't. Oh, Kiana, you were busy taking notes. I was going to give it to you first.
Thank you, Dr. Aiken.
Thank you all.